My name is Charles, I'm 68 years old, and if you saw me walking down Main Street here in Kalispell, Montana, you might think I'm just another old retiree taking my life slowly. But I'll tell you something that may leave you grounded. My own daughter gave me an ultimatum. Either I served her husband or I left the house I helped pay for. And you know what I did? I smiled, and I went to pack my suitcase. You may be wondering how such a story begins, or how a father, who gave everything for love, ends up being treated as a nuisance within his own home. If you've ever felt that, after years of dedication, you've become cold. So maybe this story is yours too. Today, I'm going to tell you how a silence answered the cry of humiliation. Like a silent old man, he made more noise with a gesture than any scream would do. In the end, you will understand the power of a choice, to come out on top, even if you are thrown down. Because sometimes, it is at the moment we leave that everything begins to reveal itself. But before we dive into the heart of this story, I need you to know something. Not all silence is weakness. The day my daughter looked me in the eye and said, "Either you obey my husband or you leave our house," I didn't fight back. I just took a step back, calmly climbed the stairs, and started packing my suitcase. But what they didn't realize, what almost no one realizes when they humiliate someone in silence, is that my smile, it was the beginning of the end for them. Because there, at that moment, something inside me broke. And when an old man decides not to be silent anymore, he does not need to raise his voice. You just need to act. If you understand what it is to swallow the pain so as not to hurt anyone, if you've ever spent nights wondering where it all got lost. So I invite you to stay. This report is not easy for me. Turning over these memories hurts, but maybe it helps someone who is living the same. If you can, leave your support, a like, a subscription, a comment saying, "I'm here," because when we feel that we are not alone, even the wounds hurt less. And now, I'll tell you how it all really started. When Tiffany called me, saying that she and Andrew were thinking about buying a bigger house, something inside me ignited. I was recently retired, had just received compensation for the time I worked in the railroad sector, and I wanted to see my daughter happy, starting a new stage of life. She's always been my weak point, you know? Since her mother left, all I had left was to take care of her as our living memory. So, without a second thought, I sold the house where I had lived with my wife for almost 30 years. I made a down payment on a part of the new house, and even though the financing was in Tiffany's name, for banking reasons, that's what she explained to me, we made a verbal agreement. I would have my space there until the end of my days. And in writing, I registered a lifetime authorization for use. Everything was clear, at least for me. At first, it felt like home. I took care of the garden, did the shopping, cooked. Tiffany said that my stroganoff reminded her of her mother's. That was enough for me. But over time, the bills started to weigh down and I covered 1, 2, 3 invoices that they forgot to pay. First the light, then Andrew's car insurance, and even Tiffany's health plan when she was unemployed for a few months. I never complained. I said to myself, "Father who is father helps without expecting gratitude." But today I see, it has a very fine line between helping and being used. Andrew never looked me in the eye. When he spoke to me, it was always in a tone of tolerance, as if talking to a guest who has stayed too long. And Tiffany, it was changing. He no longer sat with me in the late afternoon. He no longer asked if I was okay. Sometimes I heard low laughter coming from the room, and as I approached, silence took over the house. We feel it when it becomes a weight, but at the time I pretended not to feel it. I swallowed hard, because believing that your own daughter is moving away, it's a pain that we prefer to push with our belly. One day, returning from the supermarket, I saw that they had changed my seat. It was a little corner of my own, you know? The same one where I read the newspapers and watched the old baseball games. When I asked, Andrew said, "We think it looks better that way." I thought that was it. But gradually I realized that that better meant further. The armchair ended up almost in the kitchen. Then he disappeared. One day, I saw her in the basement. Dusty. That hurt more than if they had yelled at me. And you know what hurt me the most? It was remembering the last conversation I had with my wife before she left. We were on the porch, the cold wind hitting her face, and she said to me, "Charlie, help our little girl, but don't forget who you are, never forget." I promised. I promised that I would be a gift, that I would be there for Tiffany and everything. And I was. I just didn't realize that little by little, I was ceasing to be for myself. Icebreaker comment, CTA. There are times when we wake up and realize that we have been gradually erased from our own history. as if the love he gave had expired. Have you ever felt that? To be inside the house, and even so no longer be part of it? If you've been through something like this, or know someone who has experienced it, comment below with a "I've lived it" or "It touched me." Sometimes just knowing that the pain is shared, it weighs less on our chest. I started to gather papers, bills, receipts, not out of revenge, but because I felt that something was about to happen, and if that day came, as it did, I wanted to be on my feet. I knew exactly how much I'd paid in mortgage from the first year, how much insurance was in my name, and that none of the expenses were reimbursed. Everything came from my pocket, and everything was treated as if it were my obligation. One night Andrew came in drunk, kicked a chair, and complained that the house was too full. Tiffany said nothing. He just went to sleep, and I, there in the dark room, understood. I was no longer welcome. And they didn't have to say it with words. The gestures were already screaming, but what they didn't know, and this is what keeps me holding my head high, is that I never gave my story into anyone's hands. Everything I built, it was still here with me, kept, written down, documented. And the day it all came crashing down, as it did, they would see that this old man here, it wasn't just a burden, it was the entire basis of it all. Now tell me, have you ever stopped to think about what happens when those who hold in silence decide to let go of their hands because at that moment, I was already thinking about everything that would come later, and they still thought they were in control. It's the day of the ultimatum. It was closer than anyone there imagined. It was a cloudy Saturday, one of those in which the sky seems to weigh on our shoulders. I had left early as usual to do the month's shopping. He was carrying 2 large bags, one with food and the other with some cleaning items that were on sale. I've always been like that, careful, the type who buys extra detergent when it's cheap. I arrived home with my hands marked by the handles, my spine complaining, but my heart still trying to find some trace of home in that silence. I walked in the back door and found Andrew sprawled out in my old armchair, the same one my wife gave me for our last Christmas together. The remote control dropped on the arm of the upholstery, the TV screaming a game he barely watched. He turned his face slowly, as if bothered by my presence, and spoke dryly without even taking his eyes off the screen. "Since you're there, bring me a beer, and see if you stop complaining, old man." I stopped in the middle of the kitchen. The blood cooled. I placed the bags on the countertop, took a deep breath, and just replied, "I'm not an employee here." It was then that Tiffany entered, attracted perhaps by the tension in the air. Her eyes were tired, her arms crossed, as if she had already decided. I heard the words as if they were being spoken by someone else. "Father, if you're not going to collaborate with the routine of the house, it might be better to find another place to stay." I stood there, looking at her as if looking at an old photograph and trying to find the person she knew. But the girl I raised, it was no longer there. She avoided my gaze but said firmly what her husband wanted to hear. I felt the ground disappear for a moment, as if my soul had been pushed. And even then I didn't scream. I just gave a small smile, not of irony, but of those who understand, of those who finally see everything. I looked at Andrew, then at Tiffany, and said, "All right." I climbed the stairs slowly with the weight not of the bags but of disappointment. I entered the room, closed the door calmly. I didn't hit, I didn't cry. I just sat on the edge of the bed and stared at my wife's portrait, which I always left on the dresser. "You warned you," I whispered. I took out of the closet an old leather suitcase, one of those that we use only in moves that hurt. I put some clothes, my medicines, a toothbrush, and the photo frame inside. I left behind books, tools, even a blanket that my wife sewed in our early married years. I kept silence and dignity. Every fold in the shirt I fixed was like a scar being wiped clean. Before going downstairs, I looked once more at the mirror. The man who looked back at me was not weak. He was a man who decided, for the first time in a long time, to leave before he was expelled. When I passed by the room, Tiffany was on her cell phone. Andrew didn't even notice. Neither of them asked where I was going. Neither of them cared. And it was there at that exact moment that I realized what seemed like loss. It was freedom. But what they didn't know was that that old man who walked down the street with a simple suitcase in his hand took with him much more than clothes. He took evidence. He carried the memory of every penny. He took the key to what they called home, and what would come next. It was something neither of them was prepared to face. Anyway, what happens when those who support in silence decide not to support anymore? I left with the suitcase in my hand, and the wind of Kalispell cutting my face like a knife. It was late afternoon, but the sky was already darkening as if sharing what I felt inside. I crossed the streets without a certain direction, with only one certainty: I would not return. No one called me. Nobody asked where I was going. Tiffany remained on the couch. Andrew didn't even look up. The gate closed behind me with that hollow noise that we never forget. I got into the car slowly, put the suitcase in the back seat, arranged my wife's portrait on my lap as if it were people. It was just him and me again. And when I started that tired engine, I felt like I was driving away from what was left of my family, and close to what was left of me. I ended up at Pine Tree Lodge, a small motel on the side of the highway, one of those where the paint on the walls has already faded, and the heater makes more noise than heat. I took the key to room 3, thanked him with a wave, and locked myself inside. The bed was hard, the sheets rough, but that cold mattress hurt less than the couch at my daughter's house. I sat on the edge of the bed, took a deep breath, and stared at the ceiling. For the first time in many years, I was homeless. Not homeless because I still had shelter, but without a home. Home for me was the sound of a sincere good morning. It was the smell of coffee that our wife prepares. It was hearing a father and feeling that the word came from the heart. And all this, I had lost. I lay on my side and pulled my wife's portrait closer. I looked into her eyes as if she was going to tell me something. And deep down, she said. Her image brought back that last conversation, before the disease took her voice, her strength, and then her body. Charlie, help our little girl, but don't forget who you are. And that's when I understood. I helped a lot, and I completely forgot about myself. I spent that night without shutting my eyes. I kept remembering every penny I spent. Tiffany's $38,000 college dollars, the $15,000 of the wedding, dress, buffet, flowers, even the honeymoon on Lake Tahoe. When Andrew lost his job because of a fight at work, I was the one who held the bills. When Tiffany got pregnant and lost the baby, I was the one who paid for the health plan, the follow-up, the medications. I never complained. I never asked for anything. But now those who were treated as useless, it was me. And on that hard mattress, surrounded by cold walls, I asked myself the question I had avoided for years. Where did I get lost? Where did I stop being a father? And I became a butler? But the answer didn't come that night. He came the next day. When I woke up with a swollen face and a tired soul, I sat down at the motel table with a weak coffee and my old leather briefcase. Inside it were receipts, statements, all kept in silence over the years. And there, with trembling hands, I realized I was not homeless. I was about to rebuild a new one that no one else would have the power to rip me off. Because sometimes, it's only when we lose everything that we finally understand what it's like to have something of our own. But what would I do with those papers? With those proofs? With the truth that I always knew, but never wanted to show? Well, you will understand this when you know what I did the next day, and who I reached out to soon after. The next day I woke up with dry eyes. There were no more tears, just a different kind of tiredness, the one that comes when we understand that we have nothing left to lose. I went down to the reception of the Pine Tree Lodge, got a thin coffee in the old thermos, and returned to the room with my briefcase on my lap. I sat on the small table against the window and opened it slowly. Inside were the last 20 years of my life, divided into envelopes, handwritten notes, and copies of extracts stubbornly kept. A lot of people called me too organized. Now I called it salvation. I took the green notebook, the oldest, where I wrote down everything since Tiffany entered college. I did the math. I looked again. Redid. It was like looking at the story they never wanted to hear, just enjoying. That was not revenge. It was balance. It was like correcting a picture that had been crooked on the wall for years. I picked up the phone and dialed the number of First Kalispell Bank, where I always kept my account. The manager, Rick, answered me with that surprised tone of someone who thinks that the old man has nothing else to solve. I said directly, "Cancel all automatic debits linked to the Pine Street house. Mortgage, bills, insurance, everything. From today on, not a penny comes out of my pocket for that." He was silent for a moment and replied, "Mr. Charles, are you sure?" I said, "Absolutely. Take care of those who don't respect me. It's no longer part of my budget." After that, I logged into the insurance company's account online. Tiffany and Andrew's car policy was tied to mine. They didn't even know it. I went there, removed both names. 1 click, 2 clicks. Simple as that. I also canceled the additional card that Tiffany had been using since the time of her honeymoon. She never gave it back to me. He always said, "I'll use it only this month, then I'll get it right." Well, that month ended, and along with him, my patience ended too, and everything was done in silence. No screaming, no threats. I just gave them back what was theirs. Responsibility. They were so used to my protection that they didn't even realize it could end. And it was there, at that motel table, with a cold coffee next to me and my leather briefcase open, that I realized, whoever carries the base can, yes, bring down the building. I'm here, opening my heart and telling my story. If you are listening following this outburst with me, leave a like on this video and subscribe to the channel. I still have a lot in store to tell you, and maybe, in the midst of this pain, you will see yourself too, because no one grows old waiting to be discarded. But when it happens, we need to have the strength to get up. But this was all just the beginning, because after you put your phone down and end payments, I received a call that completely changed the way I saw that man my daughter called her husband. You know that feeling that the dirt hasn't been all revealed yet? What I found out next? It was much worse than I imagined. In the days that followed, the phone started ringing like never before. It started shy, a touch here, another there, but on the third day, it seemed that someone had lit an alarm. First, it was Tiffany. He left a message in a sweet, forced voice saying, "Dad, I think the bank made a mistake. The mortgage payment didn't go down. Can you check it out for me?" I sat on the edge of the bed, listening to it as if listening to an old tune out of tune. I barely finished listening to it when another message came. "Hi, it's me again. Andrew's car insurance has been suspended. What's going on?" Then came the messages with a different tone. Andrew, his voice, it didn't even look the same. "Charles, there's something wrong with the cards. It's all blocked. Did you touch it?" The tone was no longer one of superiority. It was one of despair. I just listened and wrote it down. I took a new notebook with a blue cover and started to write everything, date, time, what was said, not out of spite, but for clarity. For the first time, I was documenting not what I did for them, but what they did for themselves. And, as always, they did nothing. The phone rang morning, afternoon, and night. Restricted number, Tiffany's number, Andrew's own number. One of them sent me a message saying that the car was stuck due to lack of insurance. Another said that the card was refused at the station, and he remained silent. Their silence, years ago, hurt me, but mine now, destroyed them. Because you don't have to raise your voice to be heard. Just disappear when you are needed. Tiffany in one of the messages tried to reverse the blame. "Dad, why are you doing this to us? What harm did we do to you to deserve this?" I almost answered, but I held on, not out of weakness, but out of respect for what I was building. Because if there is a sound louder than the cry of anger, it is the echo of abandonment. And that's what they were hearing. For the first time, Andrew had no one to unload the weight of his own choices. And Tiffany, my girl, I was being forced to look in the mirror and see who she had become. And me, I was here, in a motel room with weak coffee and heavy silence, but finally with dignity. Each call was a reminder that I did the right thing, and with each touch not answered, I felt something coming back to my chest, something that had been ripped away little by little, my value. And it may seem strange, but seeing that phone ring, and not answering, was like retrieving a piece of me. But all this was just the beginning, because one connection in particular, it didn't come from Tiffany or Andrew. It came from a name I hadn't seen in a long time on my cell phone screen. And when I answered, what I heard made me rethink everything I thought I knew about that house. Because sometimes the truth does not come from those who shout. It comes from those who observe silently, for years. That morning, after another sleepless night, I decided to walk to the center of Kalispell. He needed to cool off and have a real coffee, not the one Pine Tree Lodge offered. I went to the Old Creek Cafe, a simple but honest place. I sat by the window, as I did when I was still walking around with my wife. I ordered a black coffee without sugar, and I watched the movement of the street, trying to understand at what point my life had become this tangle of silences and betrayals. It was then that I heard a familiar voice call me by name. "Charles?" I looked up and saw Bob Jenkins, my old colleague from the time I worked in bank management. He had aged well, the same face of a good guy, now with white hair and a slower walk. He came to my desk with that smile that hides concern. "Can I sit down for a minute?" I nodded. He pulled up his chair, ordered a coffee, and began to speak cautiously. I heard that you left Tiffany's house. Is everything okay? I took a deep breath. More or less, but I'm going to stay. He nodded, paused, and then said something that gave me goosebumps. I have something to tell you. I think you need to know. I stared at him in silence, waiting. Bob lowered his voice and said, Last December, Andrew showed up at First Kalispell Bank trying to mortgage the house on Pine Street. I wanted a loan of $40,000. I froze. Not for the value, but for the absurdity of it. He said he was the sole owner. He presented some documents, but there was something strange about them. When I looked up and saw Tiffany's name, I realized that something was wrong. And more importantly, his name was still listed as a lifetime authorizer. The deed did not match his version. Bob paused and continued. We rejected the request and registered the attempt as suspected fraud. We didn't make a scandal because I know you. I thought maybe it was just confusion. But now I see that it was more than that. I felt a bitter taste in my mouth. The wretch not only wanted me out of the house, he tried to take possession of it under the hood. It all made sense now. Tiffany's ultimatum. It was not an emotional decision. It was the last step in a plan that began much earlier. A calculated, dirty, cowardly plan. And the saddest? She was the one who carried my blood. A stranger's betrayal hurts. But that of a son, it strikes in silence. Bob, can you send me these records? The request, the documents he presented? He nodded. I've already separated everything. When I saw his name on the local radio news, I thought this might be on. I'll take the papers to you today. I left the cafe with my soul in pieces and my head boiling. Every step he took back to the motel felt heavier. I entered the room, threw my coat on the chair and stood there, leaning against the wall, feeling the memory tighten my chest. I remembered the day I took Tiffany to school for the first time. Graduation. The day she hugged me and said I was the man of her life. And now, she shared a roof with someone who tried to steal even what was left of my name. It's hard to accept that the love you gave was used as a ladder for someone to push you from above. But that's why I need to tell this story to the end. Because there are things that time does not erase, and only silence exposes. And if you've come this far with me, listening to all this, let me tell you, the strongest parts are yet to come. What I discovered after this coffee, it would change everything. Absolutely everything. From that moment on, it was no longer just about leaving the house. It was about proving who I was, who I still was, and who they have become. But before I acted, I needed to do one last thing. And when I did, the ground began to shake under their feet. Because what they forgot? It's just that no one manipulates all the time those who have been silent for so long. And in the next part, I'll show you what happened when they finally realized they were losing control. When Bob came out of the cafe and left me with those documents in my hands, I knew I couldn't handle it on my own anymore. It was too big, and too dangerous too. Then I remembered Morrison, a retired detective, a longtime friend of the church with whom I shared years of committees, bazaars, and community meetings. An honest man, one of those who doesn't lower his head to lies. I called him later that afternoon. Morrison, I need to talk to you, it's serious. He asked no questions. He only said, meet me tomorrow at 10 in Memorial Park. Take everything. I arrived on time. The cold autumn wind swayed the dry leaves, and the lake reflected a heavy sky. I sat on the bench near the statue of the veterans and waited. When Morrison arrived with his brown hat and old leather coat, it seemed as if time had gone back 20 years. He greeted me with a firm handshake. Tell me everything, he said. I opened the folder, showed the documents, told him about the payments I suspended, the messages from Tiffany and Andrew, and especially about the fraud attempt revealed by Bob. Morrison listened to everything in silence. When I finished, he took a deep breath and said, Charles, I'll help you. 2 days later, he called me. We need to talk. Now it's more serious than you think. We met again, this time in a discreet cafe near the bus station. Morrison brought a briefcase of him with some photos, notes, and a crumpled paper with bank records. Andrew has been visiting Glacier Peaks Casino frequently. Too often. I opened the folder and saw the images. There he was, going in and out of the casino at different times, days in a row. But it's not just a game, Charles. He has debts. Great. We estimate more than $20,000. And it's not just with a credit card. There is money borrowed from people who do not forgive delays. I felt my heart tighten. That was it. The puzzle fitted. His control over the house. The hatred for me. The need to get me out of there. It was not just pride, nor contempt. It was fear. Fear of losing the fountain that supported his castle. And the source was me. Me who paid the bills. Me who covered the delays. I, who unknowingly protected him from sinking completely. When I stopped paying, he didn't lose a father-in-law. He lost his financial alibi. Morrison continued. He tried to mortgage the house not to renovate but to cover the debts. You're sunk, Charles. And from what I discovered, this whole story may have begun long before ultimatum. I looked out the cafe window, my heart mixed between anger and sadness. How can someone sleep peacefully next to my daughter knowing that they live by deceiving, manipulating, hiding? How come she didn't see it? Or worse, did you see it and choose not to see? Icebreaker comment CTA. No, there is a pain that you can't explain properly. That's when we realize that we helped protect the wolf thinking he was part of the pack. Have you ever felt this way? Have you ever trusted someone so much that you didn't even realize how much they were using you? If this has ever happened to you or someone you love, comment here with a "I know how it is" or an "I understand you." Because at these times, knowing that someone understands you, it's already a hug. I returned to the motel with my stomach upset. Morrison said he had more to investigate, but what I already knew was enough to turn the whole story into a ticking time bomb. Tiffany was living with a dangerous man, not only for the character, but for the choices. And now, without my help, his mask was going to start to fall, and she was going to have to choose, to keep pretending she didn't know, or finally face the truth. But before that happened, there was one last step I needed to take, a step that would make everything clear, in public. Because silence is dignified, but sometimes it needs to be heard loud enough to have no doubts. And when I went to that registry office, the whole city was going to know who the real owner of that house was. I arrived at the Flathead County Courthouse on a cold Wednesday morning. The building, with its ancient columns and gray walls, looked more imposing than I remembered. I entered with my leather briefcase under my arm, the portrait of my wife in my heart and the firmness of someone who was not there out of anger, but for justice. I delivered all the documents to the responsible official, original deed with a lifetime use clause, receipts for payments, copies of voice messages, and especially Detective Morrison's report with Andrew's attempted fraud. The man looked at me respectfully, perhaps surprised to see an old man with his hands so steady as he presented evidence. He said that there was sufficient basis for a review of the case, even with the house in Tiffany's name. Your right of use for life is legally valid, Mr. Charles, and the fraudulent mortgage attempt aggravates everything. I took a deep breath. It was the beginning. I also filed the request for a restraining order, because the night before, the manager of Pine Tree Lodge called me at the front desk. He showed the images from the security cameras. Andrew, outside, pacing back and forth, trying to see out my bedroom window. He didn't knock on the door. He didn't talk to anyone, but he was there looking for fight or intimidation. And that was enough. I took the images from the manager, who, by the way, refused to give my room number, and took them directly to Morrison. He's starting to despair, the detective said. He knows he's lost control. And it was true. The silence I had maintained until then became a wall. There was no more emotional blackmail, no more screaming, no more irony. He couldn't touch me anymore. And this impotence, I was making him show himself in full. When I left the courtroom, the paper was in my hands. Official request for review of the right of use for life. Request for partial annulment of the original agreement. Preliminary restraining order. It was just leaves. But for me, they were shields. And more than that, they were mirrors, soon to be placed in front of them so they could see the reflection of what they tried to hide. I got in the car and stood for a few minutes watching the city from the outside. I remembered the first time I walked hand in hand with Tiffany through those streets. She must have been 7 years old. Everything he saw, he asked the name. She was curious, cheerful, full of life. And now, it was as if someone had stolen her soul and put a cracked mirror in its place. She was still my daughter, but almost unrecognizable, and as much as it hurt, I knew it. Sometimes we need to let the other face the bottom of the well so that they start looking for the ladder. The court delivery man was to take the papers later that week. It was just the beginning of the answer. Silent justice which does not scream, does not threaten, but arrives. With a deadline, with signature, with a notarized signature. And one thing I can assure you, no cry is imposed when it is the truth that knocks on the door. But do you know what I wanted most at that moment? That she read those papers not with hatred, but with regret. Because deep down, a part of me still hoped she would understand. I still hoped that the love I gave hadn't died for good. But I knew what was to come was going to test not only the force of the law, but that of memory. because when the officers delivered the documents to that door, whoever opened it would be forced to remember everything they tried to forget. And you won't believe who was there at the time the papers arrived. Right. No one could have predicted it. Kalispell has never been a big city. Here, people still look each other in the eye when they greet each other. They still remember the name of someone's father, who studied with whom, who was whose son. And it was precisely because of this that I knew that silence no longer needed to be mine alone. I started slowly, first at the Old Creek Cafe, where I had been drinking coffee since the days when my wife was still with me. I sat at the counter, ordered my usual black coffee, and when the waitress asked me how things were going at Tiffany's house, I just said, "I don't live there anymore. I stopped paying for everything. Now they will have to walk on their own legs." There was no anger in my voice, not even sorrow flowing, only the firmness of those who chose not to hide anymore. The next day I went to Tom's hardware store, an old friend who always helped me with things around the house. When he saw me entering alone, his eyes widened. "Charles, where's the son-in-law today?" I smiled and said, maybe now he has to learn how to hold the drill on his own. I retired from fixing what wasn't mine, and I left it there, hovering in the air, without pointing fingers, without raising your voice, just letting the truth do its job. Then I went to the market, a place where for years I bought Tiffany's dog food, diapers for a baby who never came, wine for their wedding anniversary dinner. The cashier girl, a sweet-spoken young woman, commented, "I haven't seen you together in a while." And I replied, "Yes, there are things that we hold on to for love, until the day he realizes that love was only on one side." She stopped applying the products, looked at me with those teary eyes and whispered, "Sorry, you deserved more." And I just shook my head, because deep down, that's all I wanted, for someone to see it, that someone would see who I was, while they pretended I didn't exist. And if this piece of my life can become a mirror or a hug for someone, help me carry it forward. Like and subscribe here to the channel. It makes more difference than you think. Sometimes everything someone needs to not give up. It is knowing that your pain was felt by someone else. As the days passed, the looks began to change. People who once treated me as Tiffany's dad now greeted me with respect. A man stopped me at the pharmacy. "Mr. Charles, I found out. You were a hero in silence, huh?" I thanked him, with that tightness in my chest that mixes gratitude and sadness. It wasn't ego. It was just the relief of finally being seen. The murmur grew. Small, but accurate. Kalispell is like that. He does not forget what is right, nor what is cowardly. Comments began to emerge about how Andrew always had his nose up, about how Tiffany had changed since the wedding, about how old Charles, the one who swept the sidewalk early, who paid his daughter's bills, who helped everyone without charging anything, had been missing for months. Until now the city understood why. I didn't have to invent anything. Just tell what happened. Take it easy. With truth, and with the dignity of someone who lived it in his chest. It was justice coming. Not in shouting, but in recognition. But the most curious thing was when I heard about what happened on Pine Street days later, because someone finally opened the door to receive the official papers from the court. And who was in the living room, sitting on the couch, listening to everything? It was someone I would never have imagined would return to that house. And what this person said, it was the beginning of a crack that no one there could fix. On a Friday afternoon, as I was flipping through an old newspaper in the room at Pine Tree Lodge, the phone rang. It was Morrison. "Charles, it looks like the first domino has fallen." I asked him what had happened, and he told me. Agents from Continental Recovery, the collection company here in the county, had been on Pine Street that morning. They knocked on the gate twice before Andrew left with his usual arrogance. But it only took one piece of paper to be handed over for its color to disappear. The notification was clear. Debt of more than $8,000 with maturity ignored for months. The house was now in the sights of creditors. That was just the beginning. The next day, Andrew's car, the same one I'd insured for so long, was towed in broad daylight in front of the neighbors. The tow truck stopped on the sidewalk at 2 p.m., with the engines roaring and the men wearing reflective vests. The scene did not go unnoticed. Mrs. Marlene, who lives 3 houses down, called her brother, who was a friend of mine from church, and commented, "I always thought that guy was weird. Now it all makes sense." Tiffany called me hours later. Her voice trembled. "Dad, there are people coming here. They are saying that we are going to lose everything. The car has already been taken. And the bank? The bank said that the installment of the house is in arrears." "What's going on?" I took a deep breath and responded with the calm of someone who has spent a lifetime solving other people's problems. Daughter, you are only receiving what you have sown. Nothing more, nothing less. On the other side, silence. A heavy, heavy silence. One of those that make more noise than any discussion. Tiffany hung up without saying goodbye. For the first time, he felt firsthand what it is like not to be heard. That night, I walked to the park bench where I used to sit with my wife on spring afternoons. The same bank where we promised to grow old, watching our daughter build her life. I stood there, looking at the trees, feeling the cold wind on my face, thinking about how strange the weather is. He goes around, but it comes back. And sometimes when he comes back, he brings the truth with him. It was there that a phrase came to me that I have never forgotten. When lies lose funding, the truth appears without makeup. And that's exactly what started to happen. The neighbors, once so quick to judge, now began to understand. The conversations in the market changed their tone. Charles was the one who held everything. Now I understand why he disappeared. No one deserves to be treated like he was. And the most curious? I wasn't the one who said that. It was them. People who had never given me more than a polite nod now spoke with their heads bowed, embarrassed. Because in a small town like Kalispell, the truth doesn't need to cry out. It just needs to show up. And I know, you who are listening to me on the other side may be wondering, is it all worth it? Is it worth facing one's blood for justice? And I tell you, it's not about blood. It's about respect. Because love without respect turns into handcuffs. And no one came to this world to live in prison. But look, if you think that what has happened so far has been strong, get ready. Because in the midst of all this confusion, a person appeared. Someone who had disappeared from their lives. And when she heard what they were doing to me, the game turned in a way that even I didn't expect. It was on a rainy night, one of those that the wind hits the window and seems to want to come in just to remind you that the world outside still turns, that the phone rang again. I almost didn't answer. I was tired, but something told me I needed to listen. When I put the device to my ear, Tiffany's voice sounded sweeter than usual, but loaded with something I hadn't heard in a long time. Calculus. Dad, I wanted to tell you something important. You're going to be a grandfather. I was speechless. Not out of joy, not out of surprise, but because I knew. I knew that, at that point in my life, no word from my daughter came without an intention behind it. Pregnant? I asked. Yes, she replied. I found out a few days ago. Andrew and I haven't told anyone yet. That hurt me in a place that I can't even explain. The dream of being a grandfather has always lived in me. So many times I imagined holding a child in my lap, teaching them to ride a bike, telling stories before bed. But there, at that moment, something was out of place. Her calm was not that of someone who carries a life. It was someone who carries a play. Have you seen the doctor? I asked. What is the name of the clinic? I can go with you. Silence. On the other end of the line, I heard only bated breath. It's still too early. I didn't do all the tests. That was enough. He didn't need more. I had already been manipulated once when I sold my house to pay for her wedding. I had already shut up when I saw the disrespect taking over the house. I had already accepted the empty excuses, the sideways glances, the indifference. But this time, it was different. It was an attempt to use what was left of love as leverage. And there, at that moment, I realized that my daughter had stopped seeing me as a father, to see myself as an emergency button. Tiffany, I said in a firm, unangry voice, if there is a child, she will be welcome, but blackmail never again. She hung up. No response. No tears. And I stood there, staring at the ceiling of the motel room, feeling a mixture of pain and liberation. Because when we refuse blackmail, we get rid of the chain that the other thought we still controlled. And it's curious how some memories mark us forever. Even if they don't hurt anymore, they stay there, like an open book on the shelf of the soul. And you who are listening to me, have you ever experienced something like this? Have you ever felt someone try to manipulate your love with lies? If so, share it with me in the comments. It can be a "I've lived it" or just a special memory that has marked your story. Sometimes opening this chest helps us understand that we are not alone. After that call, I understood that the tables had turned for good. There was no turning back. Tiffany tried to use what was left of the bond between us as a tool of control, and failed. But what she didn't know, what no one there knew, is that while she was lying, someone else was about to look for me. And what it brought, it was the missing piece for everything to change. Because sometimes the truth comes from where we least expect it. It was on a Wednesday afternoon, one of those when the city seems slower and people stop to talk on the sidewalk, that what I never expected to experience happened. I had gone to the grocery store downtown to get some cookies and a jar of preserves that I can only find there. I greeted Mr. Redford, who always attends to me kindly, and was leaving with the bag in my hand when I heard a familiar voice, charged with anger and contempt. "Look at him there, the mad old man." I turned slowly. Andrew was across the street walking toward me, his shoulders tense and his eyes wide as if he had nothing left to lose. "You destroyed our lives, Charles," he shouted, not caring who was listening. "You abandoned your pregnant daughter and now you want to pose as a victim?" The street slowed down. A lady pushing a baby stroller stopped. Two young men who were eating ice cream stopped laughing. The owner of the barbershop came out the door. It was as if suddenly the whole world had turned to our scene. I kept myself still. Not a step, not a tremor. He continued. "Tiffany cries every day. Aren't you ashamed?" He threw his own blood on the street. I took a deep breath. I looked at him with that look that only time teaches us to carry. Firm, calm, full of things that don't need to be shouted. I waited until the silence was heavy in the air, and then I said, without raising my voice, "Andrew, how many times have you been to Glacier Peaks Casino in the last 90 days? The impact was immediate. The people around looked at each other. The ice cream fell to the floor. One man whispered, "That's where he lost his car." Andrew froze. The color disappeared from his face. His mouth opened, but not a word came out. I took another step forward, still with the bag in my hand. "Do you want to talk about abandonment, Andrew? So let's talk. Who tried to mortgage a house that wasn't yours to cover poker debt?" He tried to stammer something, but all that came out was a, "This is nobody's business." I gave a faint smile, but it was mine, because I was the one who paid for everything while you were playing. The crowd was no longer on his side. People who used to barely look at me now looked at me with respect. A man approached and said softly, "There are things that are not talked about, but it needs to be said." Andrew, already out of breath, looked around, realized that he had lost control of the narrative and left screaming, trying to look strong, but the steps were clumsy, hurried, like someone fleeing from the mirror. I just adjusted the bag in my hand, thanked those who looked at me with a wave, and walked slowly down the street back to the motel. I didn't look back. There was nothing else there, but as I walked, a different sensation invaded me. It was as if the weight of shame they threw on me had finally slipped onto the right shoulders, and just when I thought that was the highest point in history, I received a call that changed everything. It wasn't Tiffany's, nor Andrew. It was from someone I didn't even remember who still kept my number, and what she told me, it made my heart race like it hadn't done in a long time. 2 days after that confrontation on the street, I sat in front of the judge with all the papers in hand. The motel video showed Andrew pacing back and forth trying to figure out my room. Detective Morrison's records proved the pattern of abusive behavior, the history of debts, the attempts at manipulation, and I, sitting there, did not ask for revenge. He asked for distance, respect, protection. The judge looked at the documents carefully, asked me some direct questions. I answered calmly. In the end, he said, "Based on the elements presented, I grant the restraining order. Mr. Charles is legally protected. Andrew cannot approach within 100 meters, nor maintain any type of contact, personal or electronic. If he does not comply, he will be detained." The sentence came out on paper with an official stamp, but what I felt, it was as if they had given me back a piece of my dignity. And that afternoon, the sheriff himself went to the Pine Street house to deliver the notice. I wasn't there, but Morrison told me all about it afterwards. Tiffany answered the door. Her eyes were sunken, her hair tied up anyway, like someone who hasn't slept well for days. When he saw the badge, he swallowed. The sheriff handed over the envelope and said, "Mrs. Tiffany, this is an official order from Flathead County. Her husband is legally forbidden to approach Mr. Charles. It is better that both comply or there will be consequences." Andrew appeared in the room soon after, with that shattered arrogance. He took the paper, read it quickly and threw it on the table, but he didn't even have the courage to look at the officer. And it was at that moment that Tiffany looked at her father, or rather, the sheriff holding my name on the document, and realized, perhaps for the first time, that she was no longer the one making the decisions. Neither did he. It was justice, and this time, on the right side. She didn't say anything. He just stood there with his eyes fixed as if watching a castle collapse from the inside out, and I I didn't have to raise my voice, I didn't have to knock on anyone's door. The protection that has been denied me for so long, now it had a stamp, signature, and a badge ready to guarantee. Old Charles, the one who needed to collaborate or leave, was now officially untouchable, not out of pride, but by right. And look, if there's one feeling I never thought I'd feel again, it's this: security. But the truth is that even with everything resolved on paper, what happened next showed me that old wounds could still be opened. Because in the midst of this avalanche of truths, a letter arrived for me, handwritten, no sender. And what was inside that envelope? It was something that not even the court could solve. The letter arrived on a Friday, folded into a simple envelope. No logo, no perfume, no color. The paper was thick, slightly yellowish like the old correspondence. On the front, handwritten only, Charles H. Morgan, Pine Tree Lodge, Room 7. When I opened it, I saw the seal of Flathead's registry office. I took a deep breath. It was the end of one cycle, and the beginning of another. I had made my decision days before. After talking to the folks at the Montana Veterans Housing Initiative, I understood that the house I had built with so much effort could finally fulfill a greater purpose. It was a house that had been built on sacrifice, and now it could house those who understand what it is to sacrifice without being seen. The transfer was made legally, transparently. The property became the property of the NGO, on the condition that it would serve as temporary housing for families of veterans who, like me, carry invisible scars. And I knew she would find out soon. Tiffany received the notification in the mail. The certificate was there, cold, official. The house was no longer hers, and it had never been, in fact. That which she used as a currency of control. Now it was a shelter of dignity. The next morning I heard hurried footsteps in the motel hallway. I opened the door slowly, and there she was. My daughter. Tiffany had swollen eyes, her hair wet with haste, her hands trembling. She held the papers as if they were embers. "Dad, what did you do?" I looked her in the eyes and said, with all the calmness that belonged to me, "You used the house as bait. I turned it into a shelter." She didn't say anything. Her knees faltered, and she sat right there on the sidewalk of Pine Tree Lodge. I cried in silence. But this time, that crying didn't manipulate me. It didn't hold me back. I felt compassion, yes, but not confusion. For the first time in a long time, my mind and heart were aligned. Because when we love someone, it's easy to get lost in the idea that helping is always saying yes. But sometimes, love is a limit. Love is saying no. Love is to stop feeding the whole of others so as not to disappear into it. And I know, there are things that we live and keep, but maybe by telling, we help another heart to breathe. So if this story is playing in any corner of you, like this video, and subscribe to the channel. Let's make it reach those who need to understand that dignity is not a luxury. It is the base. I stood there next to my daughter sitting, without hatred, without haste, without pity. She muttered, "You're not coming back, are you?" And I just shook my head. Not there. The silence between us was the truest we have ever had. And when she left, with the papers in her hands and her eyes lost, I felt something inside me like a door closing without making a sound. But little did I know that that story had not yet come to an end, because some decisions, when they are correct, not only transform our lives, they echo, and what came days later proved that this echo had gone further than I imagined. Sunday morning, the sun poured in through the windows of the Kalispell Lutheran Church in a way that made the old wood glow with golden hues. I sat in the back rows, as I always do, when I want to observe without being the center of attention. The church was full more than usual, and there was a strange, heavy, but different energy, not of judgment, but of expectation. Tiffany entered the center aisle with hesitant steps, holding the pulpit as if it were a shield. She seemed small in front of so many people, but there was something new about her, the courage to face not only the congregation, but its own history. When he began to speak, his voice was trembling at first, but it gained strength with each word. She told me about college, about the tuition I quietly paid, about the wedding I helped to afford, about the house that was my home, about my effort and my love, and yet how we turned it all into obligation and disdain. I felt every sentence as if a tide was pulling me in, and for the first time in a long time, my tears came to my eyes, not out of sadness, but out of relief. There, before the entire congregation, Tiffany took her guilt, acknowledged my sacrifice, and showed that, even without my words, she saw the truth. And the most incredible, it's just that no one needed to ask me for forgiveness. No one needed to lift a finger or approve. The respect was there, intact, silent, and I just lifted my hat, feeling that emotional justice had been served. It is curious how life gives us moments like this, in which the silence of years is broken not by screams, but by the courage of those who dare to admit it. And deep down, I knew that there was still one last piece to fit, a final revelation that would show once and for all who was really on the right side in this story. Because life sometimes takes a long time to deliver its full lesson, but when it delivers, it's impossible to ignore. The morning after Tiffany's confession in church, the city seemed to breathe differently. The conversations at the grocery store, at the hardware store, at the Main Street cafe, everything had changed. People commented quietly, exchanged complicit glances, and Andrew's name was always accompanied by whispers about debts and humiliation. It didn't take long for the news to reach me. He had disappeared. A note left on the door of the Pine Street house for Tiffany said only, "I can't stand all this anymore." Nothing more than that. No apology, no detailed explanation, only the silent flight of those who realize that they have built their own ruin. Tiffany didn't call me right away, but Mrs. Patterson, my longtime neighbor, texted me a short message. "He's gone." And in that instant, I felt a strange mixture of relief and quiet justice. Those who had tried to control, manipulate, and humiliate now had nothing left. There was no money coming from the old man. There was no house. There was no social prestige. Only his own absence remained, full of shame. The whole city noticed the complete reversal of order. The old man who had once been treated as a nuisance was now respected. The son-in-law who imposed ultimatums and built his arrogance on the ignorance of others was now just an empty memory. I walked through the streets knowing looks of recognition, listening to respectful comments from old acquaintances who previously did not notice my effort. And as I watched all of this, I realized that Andrew's absence didn't need to be celebrated with celebration or shouting. Life itself, with its natural consequences, was in charge of punishing him. He disappeared from Kalispell without honor, without dignity, and the city, silent witness to his arrogance, knew that he had reaped exactly what he sowed. But there was still something to be resolved. One last conversation needed to happen, a closure with Tiffany, for the story to reach its true conclusion. And I knew that when that time came, nothing could ever be the same between us. When I arrived at the small cabin by Flathead Lake, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, real silence. The wind blew gently through the pine trees, and the water reflected the sky with shades of blue and gray that changed by the minute. I put my suitcase down, watched the door creak as it closed, and took a deep breath, feeling the weight of years of tension begin to dissolve. There, no one expected anything from me. No one demanded my effort. No one humiliated me. No one told me what I should do. For the first time in a long time, I was free. I began to explore the small backyard. I planted some flowers I had brought with me, arranged the pots, and began to tend to a small bed of herbs that seemed to smile in the morning sun. Each gesture, each care for the land, was a step into myself, a return to what I had lost in the rush of supporting an entire house that had never been mine alone. The afternoons were filled with calm fishing by the lake. Sitting on the small deck throwing the line into the water, I felt the breeze touch my face and I remembered Martha. A smile appeared involuntarily, longing and gratitude mixed. There was no hurry, there were no charges, and gradually the phone that had once been ringing nonstop now remained silent, except for a few shy messages from Tiffany. She still hesitated, but there was respect. I responded sparingly, without haste, without anxiety, letting our time slowly rebuild the lost trust. I also began to devote a few hours to volunteering with the Montana Veterans Housing Initiative, quietly helping those who were now occupying the house that had previously been used as an instrument of blackmail. Every visit, every conversation with the veterans reminded me of the real value of what I did, and the power that generosity can have when directed to those who really need it. Gradually, I felt that my nights, for the first time in years, were peaceful. He slept without fear, without feeling that he was being used or manipulated. The emotional freedom that came was a strange feeling, almost forgotten, but comforting. I watched the lake at dawn, watching the fog rise, the birds crossing the sky, and I realized that every detail of the world was there for me without haste. And as I walked down the deck, feeling the coolness of the water on my feet, I realized that the greatest gift life gave me was not victory over Andrew, or public recognition of Tiffany, but quiet reconciliation with myself. I was whole, I was free, and I could finally just exist. But even in this haven of calm, he knew that the last step, the real closure with Tiffany, was yet to come. Because some stories are only completed when love and respect are restored on both sides, and the question that hung in the air was, would she have the courage to rebuild the bridge she broke, without depending on the past or any expectations? I sit on the edge of Flathead Lake, the sun slowly descending over the Rocky Mountains, painting the sky shades of gold and orange, and I feel the peace that has long eluded me. Tiffany began to rebuild her own life with honesty, respecting the limits that now protect us. Andrew disappeared from town, taking with him the pride and lies that underpinned his arrogance. I continue my quiet routine, gardening, fishing, and devoting a few hours to the Montana Veterans Housing Initiative, where I see veteran families finding shelter and dignity, the very purpose that the home that once belonged to me now fulfills. I learned that generosity does not mean allowing abuse and that dignity is not negotiable, even with those you love. Forgiveness is possible, but trust needs to be regained. Step by step, silence, which was once my refuge, has become my most powerful weapon, allowing justice and respect to be restored without shouting or humiliation, showing that sometimes the greatest power lies in not reacting with anger, but with patience and clarity. And as I share this story with you, I feel a quiet but deep connection with everyone who has ever felt the weight of ingratitude, who has fought to maintain their dignity and waited for justice without losing their cool. If this story touched your heart, a like is like a hug that warms and supports. The subscription is an invitation to come back to the next cafe and tell me in the comments which city you are watching, so we feel that we are not alone. Activate the bell so you don't lose it when the coffee is ironed again. And don't go away yet. Listen to the next true story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, each wrinkle tells a story, and each story carries a strength. Watch the next video here on the channel with another incredible story.